Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Mar Brandt. She's a scale-up revenue leader at organizations like AppsFlyer, Sitecore, and Experian. She has built and scaled high-performance sales teams and revenue strategies across both public and private companies. Thanks so much for joining us, Mar. We're excited to have you.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Neeta.
Let's dive right in. One of the big questions for a lot of people is we're coming out of a pretty challenging 18 to 24-month period post-COVID, depending on your timeline. And I don't know of any organization in which the revenue team or teams aren't feeling a lot of pressure. So what's your take on the state of revenue broadly, kind of particularly in late stage companies or newer growing public companies?
Yeah, it's been quite a roller coaster, hasn't it? Even starting with COVID, certain companies took a dip and then others were really buoyed by the pandemic. And then you had a couple of really great years there. And then all of a sudden, this economic downturn. It's been tough. And we all know the story. I think what's exciting is you're going to see revenue teams be leaner now, right? But they're going to execute better. And because they need to do more with less, if you will. And before COVID, if you think about it, we had this massive run of generally a bull market, right? I want to say it was a decade, even more. The folks who thrived in that environment have likely never seen a market like this. If you think about
Right.
today's leaders or those that were elevated to leadership in that time, they've never seen a downturn in the economy, or they've never had a significant phase in their career be involved in that. So there's a lot of hard lessons for some of our new leaders and sellers out in the market, but they're also rising, right? In this market, this is when we develop new skills. This is when great talent is honed. And I think the talent that survives this type of market and economy will be stronger. They'll be battle tested, and we'll see better revenue organizations as a result.
I do agree that there's been a lot of and maybe not enough of this. It's not fun to go through layoffs and dramatic changes, but there is a real opportunity there. Do you have
Yeah.
any specific thoughts on what some of the organizations might think about, like at a high level, or what you wish people were thinking about?
Yeah, I think they need to be thinking about how is your selling motion different in a market like this versus a positive growing market, right? I think revenue organizations and leaders specifically need to realize that if your teams are showing up the same way they did pre-pandemic or pre-2023, you've got another thing coming, right? Our buyers have incredible scrutiny on their budgets now. They have high levels of justification needed to make their spend. So that means we need to be that much more informed, aware of the value that our products and services can deliver to their organization to help enable them to make the purchase and the decision for us. We need to make buying easier for our buying committees and our customers.
This is such a great point, and it segues really well into one of the topics I wanted to discuss with you, which is around the buyer journey and how much that has changed. You and I have looked at some of this same data, whether it's Gartner or McKinsey or Trust Radius, very clear that all buyers would like to self-serve unless they have a legitimate need or a question and want to engage
Yeah.
with a salesperson. The data feels very clear to me. Yet many organizations are resistant to internalizing that information and making changes accordingly. I get it because things have felt comfortable for a long time. It seems like the rich opportunity, and if you choose not to do this, you're throwing money away. So does this resonate with you? Do you feel like it is time to evolve how we sell? Or if not, what do you think in the prior era of selling is worth keeping as we move
Mhm.
forward?
I think the short answer is yes. The long answer is if you're a revenue leader or a revenue contributor, if you haven't been evolving, especially in the last 4 years, then something's wrong, right? We're being forced to evolve. I think the notion of the changing buyer journey has been around in different iterations for decades now. I remember being given a book, Strategic Selling by Miller Hyman, 20 years ago, and it introduced the concept of a buying committee, of a
Hmm.
complex buying cycle. There's not customer here and seller here. There's seller here and a whole bunch of people potentially influencing the buy or the sale. And then 10 years ago, there was the concept of challenger sale, right?
Right.
Which the whole mantra was teach, tailor, take control.
Right.
Some of us started looking at that going, what do you mean teach, tailor, and take control? And I think that is a reflection of buyers being incredibly informed, right? Buyers being incredibly empowered. Today, they're not only all of those things, they're also enabled. They're like, I can buy right here, right?
Right.
PLG.
Right.
I can just hit the button and I don't need you. And I'm not ready to be written out of the script in an organization. So that means as a selling organization, a revenue leader, you need to adapt. And the empowered buyer is I would argue a company imperative. It is
Yeah.
not a sales team problem. So I think there's lots of ways that we can adjust how we show up to accommodate that.
One of the related data points I find interesting is that, particularly in SaaS, our business models are really dependent on renewals, upsells, and lifetime value. The data I'm seeing, and I had shared this with you too, but there's some really interesting information from G2 as of last year that most contracts in software are now less than 6 months. Just 11% are more than 2 years, which I think is very shocking. And we'll include the citation in the show notes. That alone, to me, feels like there's that affects everything, right? It affects goals, it affects comp, it affects team structure. Just that one question of duration and then the potential for that account post. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's really scary. My personal experience, especially in the last few organizations that I've run, is that I have moved them from selling short-term contracts to much longer multi-year contract. And that's the motion that you want
Right.
to see, especially as your organization matures. It's really frightening to see data that says most contracts are short-term. Maybe we need to unpack that a little bit as a sales organization. What does that mean for the products being sold? What does that mean in terms of the value realization the customer is seeing once that contract is sold? It's not just the seller. This buying journey and the customer journey after the purchase being an organizational imperative, not a sales team imperative. I think we need to look at how we're seeding the market. What are the leading indicators that are telling us this is how our customers want to buy? These are the types of things that they want to see once they've purchased so that we can actually extend the life cycle of that contract and relationship.
I totally agree. What do you think from an organizational perspective then that we need to do to deliver on that? Whether it's in sales or related teams too.
Yeah. So from an organizational design, I think we need to really understand our addressable market, right? I think it starts there. I think it also starts with segmenting the market the right way. Simply put, if you are an enterprise solution, does it make sense for you to go down market or not? And inversely, if you're B2B SaaS and focusing on the mid-market, what does it mean to go up market? What's that go-to-market motion look like? You have to wrap the organization around each of those distinct ways of going to market. And so that means your selling organization needs to be organized accordingly. Your marketing motions need to be organized accordingly. And your customer success organization, everything that touches the customer after the sale needs to be organized accordingly. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
No, I think you are. Do you think that marketing and sales and even CS should all be under revenue? Or how do you think about what it takes to build and run great revenue organizations, broader than just the sales team?
I've seen both and all of the above, especially in earlier stages. You'll see a CRO being responsible for marketing and maybe even CS. I see a lot of alignment clearly around marketing and sales being under one leader because they should have shared goals, namely revenue. And those go-to-market motions should be very tied together. CS can be a very strong partner to sales and revenue. But as an organization matures, that is a very distinct function. It's a value realization function that goes deeper and is very distinct from revenue generation.
I think interesting because some of the models I'm looking at have that as value realization. I think part of what I'm curious about is if it's harder for sales to connect directly with organizations, should that value realization actually extend in a different way? Maybe it's not as siloed within functions? I don't know. I am curious about it though. Or do you
Mhm.
think like they
Yeah.
really are they are, in your experience, they're so different, like you don't see those evolving, which is totally fair. But
No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of interdependencies between sales and all of the other functions in an organization, especially when you talk about who's touching the customer. So whether that be marketing, CSing, or partnerships in much more mature organizations that are touching the ecosystem that is also supporting our customers jointly, and even finance, right? At the top of planning and the measurement of the business as we operate together.
what about when you're thinking about scaling some more of the later stage, or even the common challenge of a former startup that has gone public and now has the real work of figuring out a business model? Like that work used to happen pre-IPO. And obviously, in the last 20
Yeah.
years, some of that work has been deferred till the company's on the public markets. How do you think about all these issues when the stage is bigger and there's more attention on an organization?
Yeah, I think it's more challenging. The bigger you are, the more mature the organization is, the more sophisticated the business is, the more challenging it is to do a couple of things. To continue to be very tightly aligned as a leadership and executive team, but also to have the teams stay focused on that intersectionality between creating revenue, creating top of funnel, then revenue, and also protecting that customer and that base of customers over time. I think it becomes much more um, difficult to do that. And so I think it starts at the top. I think the organization that is late stage and IPO ready or just coming out of an IPO needs to realize that you need to protect the systems you had in place as you mature and add process that allows you to continue to scale. It's really, really difficult to do that. But this is where, when you're getting ready for an IPO, the scalable, repeatable systems that you put in place need to endure. And I think it starts even before you cross that threshold. And we think a lot about that in late stage companies, such as those like AppsFlyer, where I was for 3.5 years.
Yeah. Building on that, one of the things I was curious about because of your experience at AppsFlyer and some of the other orgs you've been at, think about structuring goals and incentives to get the most out of teams under pressure. If you've got your sights on an IPO, that is game time. Anything you can share with us about that?
Yeah, I think goals and incentives need to be aligned. Obviously, easier said than done, but
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of different ways you can do it, right? First of all, we need to really make sure, and I'll just speak from the perspective of a revenue leader and sales incentives, we need to make sure they're aligned to the business objectives. And then they need to be aligned up and down the organization from ICs to executives. We need shared goals, ideally that overarching business objective. Strong incentive compensations do a couple of things. They incent the right behavior, again, tied to the right objectives. Secondly, I think they're great motivators, and also by virtue of that, great retention tools for especially your revenue and sales teams. And then I think thirdly, they're financially responsible.
Right.
They need to be
Right.
both good for your revenue teams as well as the company. Some of the great comp plans I've seen are simple and straightforward. They index toward rewarding the right contributions and outcomes delivered by the right roles versus applying gates or hurdles to achieving a financial reward. I think sellers are too sophisticated for that, and it demotivates them. A great comp plan is not a cost management tool, it is a revenue accelerator.
I love that. I think that is such a great way of thinking about it. I totally agree with you that focus on the what do we want the business to do? What do we actually want longer term out of it? Feels very clear. I feel really passionate about that too. I see a lot of organizations in which I'm not sure why, but it almost seems like they're so focused on a very near term goal that they're really missing that bigger question of, is this actually what we want in a year or two from now? But do you think
Right.
it's just that people are getting caught up in these are high pressure situations, obviously. We know that we've been in those. But why, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
why that's happening? Is there something I'm missing too, maybe?
Yeah, I think organizations, especially the earlier stages, are really challenged with planning, especially related to comp plans and incentives, planning 1 or 2 years out and thinking about the design of compensation in accordance with that, right? And I think at the end of the day, it's about planning, having a tight alignment with the finance organization who sets the initial goal for the revenue teams and the organization as a whole, making sure that goal is validated, rationalized, and examined from across the organization. If this is our target this year, what does 2 years out look
Right.
like? If we can grow this much this year, can we repeat that next year to the ability that we can predict and forecast 2 or 3 years out? I think flexing that muscle is harder to do, easier to talk about, harder to do, and to translate that into a compensation plan that's forward looking is very difficult.
And I
Very
think
difficult.
really road testing those assumptions, because I have quite often seen someone hand you a plan with assumptions that if you even poke slightly, it's clear they're not going to be achievable.
Yeah.
And yet everyone, it's almost like we ignore that at our peril, and people try to move forward and you hope something will change. And it generally doesn't, in my experience.
A testament to this short-term versus long-term thinking is every year comp plans change. And
Sometimes
it's
even
like,
less than a year.
and,
Shouldn't, but they do.
and why? There's a reason why there's language in comp plans that say the business has the right to change this at any time. Ideally, you're not doing that. That is a
Right.
massive demotivator for your revenue organization.
Right.
But the fact that a company has even that language, the fact that they do it is a sign that long-term planning is difficult to manifest in compensation plans, let alone other things.
I think planning is a real challenge. We had a colleague on who's a CFO and kind of talked about this, but I feel like we don't talk about planning enough. And so maybe we'll have to have you back with the CFO to talk about some of this, because I think it is a broader question. And for me, I think a lot of the times I come back to what are the investments that we really believe will move the needle? And it comes full circle to the buyer journey conversation, right? Because I think those have changed. There are a number of direct response, highly attributable tactics, particularly on the marketing side, that are deeply inefficient and very ineffective as well. If you and I were partnered together in an org and I just sent you a bunch of crappy content leads, I really doubt you'd want your teams working those, right? We both know it. And
Yeah.
yet those are still assumptions that we build into plans on the regular. I realize we can't solve it today, but I think about it all the time as an opportunity. With that context, do you have any recommendations for what you think revenue leaders could keep in mind when they're thinking more broadly across the executive team, specifically for CFOs and CMOs, since those tend to be very close partners to the sales leader, or depending on the organization?
There's so much interdependency
Mhm.
with CROs and revenue leaders, and specifically CMOs and CFOs. I'll start with CFOs. I think we have the greatest opportunity to build that relationship in a much stronger way, starting with annual planning or semi-annual planning. I think that starts with much more open communication and education from both sides. I think CFOs would tell you they're furthest away from the field and from revenue. So they need really good CRO partners who can inform them about what's going on, give them the voice of the customer in the field. That helps color the design of things like compensation models, targets, incentives, and investment. It helps inform what we do on the top of the funnel with marketing and on the product end of things. That relationship could be so much more stronger and multidimensional if the CFO and the CRO was much more aligned and planned earlier in the year, but also more closely together. Planning along with communication and education are really important. And then the other piece is measurement, right? Oftentimes you'll have a CRO who has a really strong sales operations and metrics group, but then you'll also see that the revenue operations team sits within the CFO. They shouldn't be looking at metrics distinct from each other. They should build those metrics jointly and have a common language for what we're measuring together. If we build our goals and KPIs together correctly, and then track them not in silos, but together, we can start to have much stronger alignment across those two offices. I would argue that it's the same for CMOs. I think CMOs are maybe measured not necessarily on the right things. And maybe it's too much top of funnel stuff and less about quality than it should be. At the end of the day, there should be a revenue objective shared across these two organizations, because that's really the outcomes that we want.
I think you're spot on. And I think you're also alluding to the challenge a number of organizations fall into, which is that measurement and attribution are not the same thing. And I think we've come out of an era when attribution and an impression of causality that I don't think is real has dictated a lot of our investment choices. Sometimes the conflict between sales and marketing leaders and finance, or two of those organizations are happy and one isn't. I've seen that in a number of companies, and you're nodding. I'm sure you've seen that too. And I think that it's also an output of the buyer journey, right? Because if 100% of buyers effectively are trying to self-serve whenever possible, then how is it that we could directly attribute every step along their journey? I don't think it's possible. Like, it inherently must be beyond the view of what any of us could do, even in a perfectly instrumented organization with the world's best SEO programs and paid ads and whatever we typically do in venture-backed companies. If you give marketing leaders the same revenue goal as the sales leader, but you have to also let them do different things. If you give me that goal and then expect me to reach the results with tactics that no longer work, and we know they don't work, you're going to be disappointed every time, right? This is like, why do the marketers get fired first and then the salespeople? I think that's what's happening broadly. I don't know. I'll pause there.
I agree. And I think your revenue engine is broken in that respect, right? Because you're looking at the wrong metrics. And then to your point about the buyer's journey, by the time we see the buyer, most of the journey is over. They're ready to transact. There's pre-funnel activity that's happening that we don't have visibility to. So what metric do you assign to that?
Yeah. The metrics that I would assign are closer to earned media metrics. Where I've had a lot of success is in thought leadership programs. And this is a whole longer conversation. But in my mind, the definition I like is that thought leadership is newsworthy, additive, and non-transactional. The way you know it works is your buyers will tell you. Now, this isn't an organization where I think there is trust among key stakeholders. If you think you're going to generate an ebook or something out of this and then gate it and have leads, this will break immediately. That's not how it works. And again, we know that from the buyer journey data. But I think there's other things like that you have to change the measurement to be able to do that. If we try to do that on direct attribution, it's self-defeating, even if it's the most innovative idea in the world that all of your buyers would benefit from.
Yeah, and I agree. And I also think you have to change the strategies and the tactic, right? I'm a big proponent of looking at marketing and selling as joint activities in a multifunctional, multi-persona approach. Because there are buyer committees, and because there are personas. I think the reading said 22 different personas in a buyer committee. Right? Incredible. If you distill those into categories, there are your technical and user buyers, the folks that actually manage them. And then there's the executive buyers. Then there's your economic buyers, the people that hold the purse strings. Then you've got your finance and procurement folks. It's very horizontal. How do you create meaningful brand equity and credibility with all of those personas even before your active sales process starts? Yeah, I think you need to change the approach. It needs to be a multifunctional, interdisciplinary approach that involves everyone in the organization, including executives and including investors, I believe. We all need to be touching the prospective customer. And then I think you need to figure out what measurement looks like in an environment like that.
It's almost like self-serve marketing too, if I'm poaching that term. Because in addition to the 22, the thing that I always come back to is that data doesn't even include the amount of turnover in corporations, right? We know that average tenure for CMOs and CROs is 18 months. I saw some interesting data, and it came up in one of our conversations with a colleague who's in the healthcare space, and she was noting that health plans on average have employees, basically they're expecting employees to be there for about 3 years. So that tells you something about turnover too, across the enterprise. And so when you think of the 22 people, is that a new hot person? Have they just gotten promoted?
Yeah.
What are the contract cycles? There's just so many variables. So then the idea that we're just going to have Mar and her sales team go hassle 22 people, which is crazy anyway.
Turnover is a massive issue in sales. The second piece is the miscommunication or lack thereof across the organization. These 22 personas, we're assuming they're actually talking to each other. In some organizations, I don't know how many meetings I've been on where my buying committees are introducing themselves to each other. And in some cases, my people are introducing themselves to or facilitating the introduction of buying committee members for the first time.
Yeah, totally. And they've probably been in the same org for 5 years or something crazy. I'm not
It's
surprised to hear.
reality. It's reality.
Yeah. No, I think
It's
great.
very complex. Yeah.
It really is. Are there any other big takeaways or anything else that you'd want to share around where you are as you're thinking about some of these big ideas too?
I think what I'll maybe go to your question earlier around running great sales teams. I think there are some key disciplines that revenue leaders need to be thinking about or remembering, right? First of all, I think a very disciplined and rigorous operating cadence is foundational to operating in this market right now. One of the key byproducts of that is accurate and strong forecasting, especially when you're later stage or early public organizations. That's one of the key disciplines. And there's a lot of sub-disciplines underneath that. Even just taking a look at the quarter and breaking it down to months and weeks. And how do you create pipeline and manage pipeline and then close deals and forecast in between that in the most accurate way possible? What are the KPIs we're measuring the entire way through, right? From marketing funnels all the way down through the bottom of the actual sales funnel, and who's accountable for those things. Operating disciplines are very important in this environment. Great leaders need to be in the battlefield with their teams. They are practitioners, right? They need to be part of the process. Sales is so much about taking strategy to tactical execution and really delivering on repeatable execution and doing that to deliver the right outcomes for your organization. You can't do that behind a desk. You've got to be in the field experiencing that with your people. What that results in is maybe the third pillar here, and that is you can build incredible cultures in environments like this because you're actually going through this very difficult time together. You're living the highs and you're experiencing the lows, and you can build really strong DNA from that kind of environment. Incredible cultures are above and beyond performance driven and a desire to win and having really great selling fundamentals. It's about finding the right talent that belongs in your organization, matching that up with what success or what great looks like in your specific organization, and building the right DNA of the team from there. I think environments like this, particularly environments where the buyer is empowered and the market is in flux, is a great time to be creative and try to develop special organizations.
I think that's so incredible. I don't know that I've really heard very many sales execs talk about needing to stay close to the field and to the customer. But I think that's totally right. That really resonates with me. And that's a very wise approach. Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I have just one last question for you. You have had such a range of companies and organizations that you've worked in. Well, I'm curious to know, what do you think high performance companies do that is different from the average or from the run of the mill?
Yeah, great question. I'll point to the topic of culture. I read an article recently by McKinsey, which talked about organizational health and how that's a strong predictor of value creation and competitive advantage for organizations in a sustained way. And what really resonated with me was this idea of this generational shift in the type of leaders that are effective in healthy organizations right now. It's the change from this sort of unilateral decision-making or decision-making in closed doors to empowerment, but also decisiveness, right? So it doesn't mean we don't make decisions, but we decentralize decision-making. We use technology to do that, and we give employees and the organization as a whole the agency to perform their respective jobs in the way that they need to. I think this has translations to how we show up for work and where we show up for work, right? Which is really a byproduct of the pandemic era. I think that's really one of the things that makes high-performing organizations successful because it feeds into culture. It's culture additive, it's culture supportive, empowering your people, but also delivering the right healthy metrics for business, a great combination, and it drives the right outcomes.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us, Mar. I knew this would be a great conversation. Really appreciate having you.
This was so much fun. Thanks, Neeta. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
You got to come back soon.
Will do.
Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. And if you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes.